So welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. So for anybody I've not met or perhaps who hasn't joined one of these sessions previously, I'm Rachel Murphy. So I'm the volunteer manager for the National Plant Monitoring Scheme. And this webinar today forms part of our NPMS summer programme of online and in-field training and engagement events. So please do take a look on our NPMS webpage for any further events and webinars throughout the season. I'm really pleased to introduce my colleague today, Sarah Shuttleworth. So Sarah is a specialist botanical advisor at Plantlife and a fantastic botanical trainer who actually is super familiar with the National Plant Monitoring Scheme as well. So we're really, really grateful that she's kindly providing this session today. So thank you, Sarah. I shall hand over to you.
Great, thank you for that introduction, Rachel. It's great to have so many of you here today, especially when, as Rachel said, it's being recorded. The temptation just to go, do you know what, I'll catch that another time. But if you're anything like me, the number of times I've done that and then have not actually watched it is quite high. So yeah, well done for those who have turned up. So what we're going to cover today really is looking at 5 botanical families, of which there are obviously lots and lots and lots of others, and I'll explain which ones we've chosen and why. So yeah, we're going to have that brief introduction to those 5 plant families, and brief is the word because at the end of the day we could probably cover one family in 1 hour if we wanted to go into some real detail and look at all of the kind of common examples. So we're just going to do a brief one. The idea behind that is that hopefully this experience will widen your botanical vocabulary, and hopefully if you've managed to come to one of our other webinars before about sort of anatomy and learning the names of the bits of the flowering plant, then that, you know, is a really good basis for this to kick off from. If you haven't, don't worry, I will try and you know, when we use new terminology, I will try and explain it. But if there is a botanical term that I use that I haven't explained, do put it in the chat or the question and I can come back and explain it later. Hopefully this will also help you to gain confidence in plant identification in general. And we're going to be learning through a kind of combination of descriptions, photographs and graphics as well. So which 5 families are we going to start with and why? So the ones that I've chosen are generally quite common families, have quite a few species in them in the UK, so you're likely to encounter them. And the majority of them, except for one, are very, very distinctive families, and then they have sort of quite solid unifying features which make them recognisable. The one that's a bit of an outlier here with regards to that is Rosaceae, the rose family, just because there are not that many obvious unifying features, although there are a few, but they're subtle, and you've got sort of species that can look wildly different from each other. But the reason we've included it is because really there are so many common species that you're likely to come across that are within that family, so it can be a useful one to sort of look at. So we're going to start off with Fabaceae, the pea family here. So really kind of the reason, you know, it's so classic and easy to spot is because of that classic pea flower. Now, if we were aliens and we just landed on planet Earth, we might not know what you mean by a pea flower. But because most of us are probably familiar with sweet peas or growing kind of runner beans and that sort of thing, we kind of know what you mean when you say pea flower. That sort of big petal at the back, which can be in different positions, and the sort of front bit, as you can see in these pictures. But what I thought we'd do at the start of each family is sort of run through a few examples of species that are in that family, which then might sort of familiarise yourself with the family. So here, as some examples, we've got the first common bird's foot trefoil, Lotus caniculatus, really nice sort of grassland, common plant, get it in your lawns as well if you're lucky enough. So that's the first one. We've also got then kidney vetch, which bit more of a sort of calcareous specialist potentially. Anything with vetch on the end, or trefoil, vetchling, they're all going to be within the pea family usually. We then got gorse, of which the flower is certainly very recognisable as being part of the pea family. However, the leaves are quite different, and don't really sort of fit with the rest of them. So it's kind of an outlier in regards to its leaves. And there are a few different species of gorse in this country. Dwarf gorse, I think, is one of our indicator species for dry heathland as well, for example. And then we've got melalots. So they sort of have these tall racemes of yellow flowers, just beginning to open and come into flower now, actually. Quite a substantial big plant. You can often get it on path edges, in woodlands or grasslands. And then hop trefoil, one of my personal favourites, which again sometimes gets overlooked because some of these small clusters of yellow head trefoils can often get a little bit tricky to identify. So let's look at the sort of flowering features of this family first. So this image here is essentially showing you like a cut through of a pea flower along its length. And we can see that we've got a very distinctive flower shape. We've got 5 petals overall, with the largest being the standard, or sometimes called the banner petal at the back. And quite often it is sort of flipped back on itself. But sometimes in some of the smaller, more diminutive species, it's slightly more folded over the other petals. So it's not always flipped back. We've then got the wing petals, which sort of neatly either side, a little bit less obvious. And then you've got the very, very distinctive sort of almost banana-shaped keel petals, which are down underneath. Sort of everything's there protecting all the flowering parts. We've got one style leading to the stigma, and then we've got one carpel, which is where we've got the developing fruit inside. And obviously in this case, it'll be the peas. The sepals have been fused to create a singular calyx, and the sort of flowering parts then all sort of insert into that. We've got 10 stamens altogether, and they're often joined sort of into a tube below. I mean, it's not necessarily a major feature of this family, but that's just useful to know. So let's look at some real life examples. So as I was mentioning, we've got gorse here. I've got the 2 images here, one to sort of reflect that cut through image. And you've got these big, almost like upper and lower part that's part of the calyx here, which would be nicely encircling the bud as it's forming. Whereas in gorse, you've also got this extra little bit here, which isn't really a leaf and it's not really part of the calyx, and it's referred to as a bracteole when you look at the description for this. So I just thought I would show you exactly what that means, because sometimes when you can be reading through a description and it will say something like that and you're like, what bit are they talking about? So that's what the bracteoles are on gorse. Lovely flower, worth having a good sniff when it's out in flower because it smells like coconut or butter to some people. So that's a really nice one. Something like sainfoin, you've got that banner petal, which is much more lying flat on top of the other petals, but it's lovely and striped and quite distinctive. Common rest harrow, we've got the banner petal doing its thing flipped back, and we've got that huge sort of canoe-like keel petals underneath, sort of forming at the front. Interestingly, the rest harrows, they key out quite quickly in the book because instead of having multiple flowers on one flowering head, they have a single flower sort of born out from around the parts of the plant. So yeah, that one's one of the questions quite early on. Like in complete opposite to that, things like the black medic, you've got that kind of cluster, just like with the trefoils and the clovers, you've got this cluster of flowers all on one head. So each individual one of these is an individual pea flower. On this one, again, the banner petals are sort of folded down either side of the other ones. Let's look at some of the vegetative features then of the pea family. So as I said before, the sepals are fused together. There are 5 of them, and they form this calyx tube that the rest of the flower sort of is inserted into. A really important feature of these species, of this family, is the stipules. Now, if you've never heard of the word stipule before, don't worry. It's essentially a leaf-like structure. So not one of the leaves of the plant, it's a leaf-like structure, a bit like sometimes when you're talking about bracts, but this one's got a very specific name, stipule, because it comes from the base of where the leaf is coming out of the stem. And some families have stipules and some don't, and that can usually be quite a key thing to remember. In this family that does have stipules, and they're usually quite conspicuous and obvious and quite leafy in their arrangement, Something like red clover, for example, which this is sort of loosely modelled on, they're quite sort of like almost like lots of veins running through them, and it comes to a point, and usually red, sometimes green, as you'll see in another photo. Then the leaves themselves are actually quite variable. However, in so many of the pea family, they are quite often trifoliate, which means they are made of 3 leaflets, just like in the clovers like this. Or sometimes they are pinnate, which means that they have the single stem up the middle, and then they've got all these individual leaflets on either side. Let's look at some real life examples. So, for example, we've got tufted vetch here. So this whole thing is the leaf. It is made up of these individual leaflets along the main stem. So this is a pinnate leaf. Just similarly, bush vetch is also the same. One of the key things about bush vetch, which is often quite useful, is that the leaflets are often referred to as eggs on a shelf, because the individual leaflets are sort of slightly pear-shaped or egg-shaped. So that can be a really good way of telling that you've got bush vetch instead of common vetch or tufted vetch, that sort of thing. The clovers, as I mentioned, you've got the trifoliate, the 3 leaves forming the whole leaf, so the leaflets. Whereas on something like gorse, they've been reduced to these sort of spines, so quite different from the rest of the family. Here's the stipule of red clover. So quite often it is actually sort of red veined, but in this one it's green, but that could be because it was a young specimen. But again, the stipules can be really key on identifying species within this family. Here we've got spotted medic, which has this almost like Dracula-esque kind of collar stipules, and it has these little teeth on them as well. Very, very different to the leaves, which would look quite a lot like a kind of clover for spotted medic. So yeah, quite different. So then the fruiting features. So surprisingly, the majority of the fruits within the pea family are in a pod full of peas. So that can be another really easy way to tell that you've got a member of the pea family. So usually an elongated pod, which can often split into 2 valves, maybe along the centre, sort of opening like a book, or quite often they kind of twist as they ripen to release the seeds. But sometimes there isn't a pod and you just have sort of like a one-seeded type thing that doesn't resemble a sort of pea pod. Or sometimes they're rounded or have burrs or hairs or hooks, which is obviously a method of attaching themselves to an animal to get moved to a new location, and circled around. And in fact, the pea family in the UK has quite a variety of different shaped pods, but actually over in the Mediterranean, the variety of pod shapes is even greater. So it's absolutely astounding, actually, the sort of way that nature has created these different methods. So let's look at some actual photos. Here we've got tufted vetch again, but the pods, which very much classic pea, open them out and there are the peas. Things like the common bird's-foot trefoil or the horseshoe vetch, they're sort of arranged in this spiral, which is how the flowers would have been arranged. And then you've got these mini little pods. With horseshoe vetch, it's one of the classic things about it is that the pods form these sort of corrugated, crinkly type shapes. So yeah, look out for that if you're on any calcareous grassland. It's a really fun one, and it's just sort of starting to pod at the moment. Whereas the black medic, as we saw before, they've got these like little coils instead of pods, and they turn black. Each one obviously is there for where there was a flower. And the whole thing will turn black as it matures, which is why it's called black medic. So leaving the pea family behind and moving on to Lamiaceae, the dead-nettle family. Again, a really, really classic, obvious to spot family, mainly because of the fact that the flowers are sort of fused into these sort of hooded corollas or shapes. Although there is another family, the Lariaceae, which the figwort family, which has some with very similar type of flowers. But there's a few features in this particular family that means that you know that you've got the dead-nettle family. So just some examples of this family. We've got botany, which recently changed its name. Well, I say recently, it probably happened a while ago, from Stachys, now it's Botanica. And that's a really lovely sort of good grassland species. Red dead-nettle, we've just got the individual flower. Again, one of the most reliable ones to find in flower outside of the season, pretty much flowers all year round. So it can be a really good one to get kind of practice using keys with, because you can do it out of season, ready for the next year. You've got bugle, which is finished flowering for this year. It's more of a sort of woodland spring type plant, although you do get it in grassland as well. And then we've also got the mints. So this is pennyroyal, which isn't a common one, but all of the mints are within the dead-nettle family. Something like ground ivy as well is in this family, and obviously a white dead-nettle as well in the dead-nettle family. So let's look at those classic flowers then. So what we've got essentially are petals that have fused and sort of designed or created to form this corolla. So if you're not familiar with the word corolla, it simply is the plural term for all of the petals together. And it's always used, especially when the petals are fused together. It would be describing that the corolla is this colour, the corolla is this wide across, that sort of thing. So it's really good to get familiar with that. And it usually has like a tube that then inserts into the calyx. So it will often refer to it as the corolla tube. So usually it's clearly two-lipped with the sort of upper hood and then the lower lip. But things like bugle might have quite a reduced upper lip, but a lot of them do have quite obvious two lips. And then the lower lip is usually then in four sort of in different lobes. So you might have side lobes and a central lobe, or even further lobes on the lip. And that sort of description will be mentioned in the guide. So for example, you can see on bugle here that we almost don't really have an upper lip at all. There's just a sort of remnant bit here. Whereas on all these other species, you've got quite an obvious upper lip or hood. And quite often the stamen are sort of nestled underneath that hood. And when you think about it, it's all a very good design so that when insects come to visit, they have this lovely lower lip as a landing pad. And as they're fertling around trying to get their sweet rewards, the upper lip would almost be bending down over the top of the insect, rubbing all of that pollen all over them. So it's very, very clever design, really. Then there are vegetative features, though, that can be used for this family as well. One of the key things is that the leaves are always opposite each other. They're not alternate, so they're always like mirror image on the stem. And we don't have any stipules in this family, so there's no extra little leafy bits to look out for or to sort of look at. The stems are always square. Now, obviously, the variation on how square they are can vary, and maybe whether you just got raised lines versus real straight edges. But yeah, that's a really useful one. And the flowers are sort of nestled in amongst leaf-like bracts. So although we don't have stipules, we do often have slightly other leafy-like bits in between the flowers or around where the flowering head is. And those are the bracts. The other interesting vegetative features are the sepals. As we were talking about, they are fused together into a calyx, and the shape of this calyx and the number of teeth and things and how many, whether it's lipped or not, is really, really important in this family for when you're looking through the book or keying them out. So yeah, they're more or less five-toothed with often an upper and a lower lip, sometimes very, very obvious upper and lower lip, sometimes it's a little bit less obvious. But counting those teeth is really important as well. Usually got 4 stamen, but sometimes only 2, and they're fused to the corolla tube, which is the flowering parts. And this is the next really key thing. The ovary is made up of 4 lobes, which ripen into fruit into 4 separate one-seeded nutlets. And what that essentially means is that when you would pull the little flowering corolla out and you're left with the calyx, you would peer down and you'd see this lovely arrangement of what looks like fresh baked buns in a pack, 4 of them. And that is one of the easiest ways to see that you've got something from the dead-nettle family. And then interestingly, it's also important to note that the style, which is that stalk-like structure for the stigma, always arises from a hollow between those lobes. So let's look at some actual images of those. So you can see here on the marsh woundwort and the hedge woundwort really clearly that the flowers have obviously dropped because they finished or somebody's pulled them out. And you can see those 4 one-seeded nutlets nice and clearly in the base. And, such a great exercise. Go out there, find some red dead-nettle and just gently tease out one of the flowers just to look at that for yourself, because it's really, once it's there and you've seen it, you'll be like, yeah, I totally got this. Then with the self-heal, you can see the calyx here. You've got that quite clearly distinct upper and lower lip of the calyx. And that's quite a distinctive shape, the self-heal overall. Whereas something like the ground ivy, it's a little bit less obvious, but you have got an upper and a lower lip. So we're going to move away from the dead-nettle family, but do think if you've got any questions for the end about any of these families, just start jotting them down now and we can try and cover them at the end. So moving on to the Apiaceae family, the carrot family. Now you might be more familiar with this being called the umbellifers, Umbelliferae or something it was called, but quite a while ago that changed to Apiaceae, but it is still the carrot family. And often people say that umbellifers was a better description because obviously it's talking about the fact that the flowers are arranged in an umbel, as we'll see in a minute. So some examples of this family, cow parsley is the obvious one, really all over the countryside now, all along the road verges, pretty much just finished now for the year, and we're getting more sort of rough chervil coming in its place. Quite helpfully with quite a few of these white lacy flower type umbel ones is that they have a distinct flowering season that moves on to a different species afterwards. So once you kind of look that up in the book and see that after cow parsley you have rough chervil, and after rough chervil you have upright hedge parsley, that can kind of be really helpful for learning as well. Even something like sea holly is in this family. It's probably one of the least sort of ones that look like it. There are in fact some other ones that really don't look like it, but they're a bit more rare. But sea holly is sort of roughly an umbel, and then obviously all the leaves and bracts and things have gone very glaucous and spiky to adapt to their habitat. Something like the corky-fruited water dropwort, bit of a specialist over here in the southwest. Not one you're going to have everywhere, but this one, obviously, as you can tell, that perhaps the fruits are quite key in identifying it. Something like pignut, which again finished for now, get in woodlands and grasslands. It's really rather delicate and not a big plant at all, and really, really finely divided leaves. And then a bit of another rarity that's local to me, get it all over the country, but there is some down near me, which is shepherd's needle. Used to be a really common arable plant, but now with all our arable plants that are decreasing, it's become quite rare. But that one keys out very quickly in the key because of these enormous, long, sort of needle-shaped fruits. So yeah, one that's worth looking at if you ever get a chance. And then something like Alexander's, again, an earlier season one, yellowy, greeny flowers, introduced, but very much naturalised here now, and almost becoming perhaps a little bit of a pest in some locations. So some of the kind of key features of this family, so we've got alternate leaves here. So unlike the dead-nettle family where we had opposite, we've got alternate. We don't have any stipules, but we do have this really interesting sheathing, sort of inflated bases to the leaf stalks. So where the leaf stalk comes down, that kind of whole base of where it comes to the stem is really quite inflated. Really obvious in certain species, like Angelica, and we'll see some photos of that in a sec. But in some species that are smaller, obviously it's going to be less obvious. The flowers themselves are actually quite small, usually white. However, there are quite a few that are yellow, pepper saxifrage, parsnip, that sort of thing. And the flowers are basically in a little mini umbel that is then part of a bigger umbel, and that's how you get that whole flower shape in general. There's 5 separate petals. As you can see on the hogweed here, those are sort of split down and almost look like they're divided in 2. And it's worth noting as well that you can see some of these petals on the inside are much shorter than the ones on the outside. And that's just so that they can form this umbel arrangement and they're not all crowded over each other. Why waste resources having petals overlaying when you don't need to? The ovary is inferior with 2 carpels. So we'll go into a little bit more about how we work out whether we've got an inferior or a superior ovary when we get onto the rose family, because it's sometimes quite important. But the fact that we've got these 2 carpels, which then form these 2 lobes and 2 sort of sided seeds, basically. So yeah, the fruits divide into 2 parts, and how the fruits are can be so important for identification. Are they ridged? Are they winged or flattened? Have they got hooks, hairs, all sorts of things. So really sometimes this whole group, you need to see them when they're fruiting in order to identify them. So here's Angelica with those largely inflated sheaths at the base of the leaf stalk. And then we've got a nice variety of different fruits here, just to show you. Burr chervil, which obviously you can see it's going to be acting like a burr and get stuck to animals' fur or people's socks. And then you've got some of these other ones with like ridges or spines, that sort of thing. Really, really important thing to get your head around when you're learning about the carrot family is the bracts and the bracteoles. So essentially, if you haven't got this bit right in your head, when you're reading the description as on a species and it says there are no bracts, but there are bracteoles, and you don't know what is what, that's going to make it very confusing and difficult to then know whether you've got that correct species. So essentially, bracts and bracteoles are like extra bits of leafy vegetation that isn't like a true leaf. And depending on where they are on the flowering structure denotes whether they are a bract or a bracteole. So this one here has nothing. It doesn't have any extra little leafy bits underneath any of the umbels or main umbel. This one has some extra little ones under the main umbel, but nothing underneath the little ones. So it has bracts. These are called bracts, but it doesn't have any bracteoles. This one has the ones under the mini umbels, known as the bracteoles, but it doesn't have any bracts. And this one has both, so it has both bracteoles and bracts. And if you can really get that solidified in your mind, then that will be so helpful for you when you're looking at it. So let's actually see what they look like on a real plant. So for example, something like wild carrot, which is probably just starting to flower about now, you'll be able to see that it has some really rather fancy looking bracts underneath the main umbels that are what described as pinnatophyid, which means they're pinnate-like. They have divisions sort of in them, so that's worth going and having a look at. Something like rough chervil has little bracteoles, but it doesn't have any bracts, and these bracteoles are quite sort of leafy-like. And then something like the corky-fruited water dropware, it has bracts and bracteoles that are quite sort of nothingy, really. They're just sort of these thin bits of vegetation. But yeah, worth going and checking out bracts and bracteoles if you get a chance. The other thing that's really important when you're looking at the carrot family, it often wants to talk about how divided your leaves are. And this in itself is a really useful tool for lots and lots of things, but especially in ferns as well. Once you've got your head around this, that will help you with that group as well. So the really important thing to remember is to count 0, which definitely I used to forget to do and get myself into a right muddle about how many times pinnate things were. But if you imagine that this is a single leaf, then that's not divided at all. So it's not at all pinnate, but you still have to count that it's the 0. So on the first one, you count the 0 as the main bit going up the middle and 1 for the bits that are coming off. So that is once pinnate. Over on here, you've got to count the 0 up the middle. You've got 1 division there and 2 division there. So 1, 0, 1, 2. So you've got twice pinnate. Whereas the mistake can be often to count 1 from the middle bit up here, and then you end up thinking that you've got something that's 3 times pinnate when actually you don't. And again, it goes all the way up. So here for 3 times pinnate, 0, 1, 2, then 3. And what you might find is sometimes that the little red leaflets, obviously they would probably be green, might look like that they're also divided. They could be just deeply toothed or lobed, because unless it goes right down to the midrib part, then it's not sort of technically divided into individual leaflets. It could be that it's just toothed, but that's a thing. The nice thing is, though, is that they do tend to give you a broad sort of 2 to 3 times or 3 to 4 times pinnate, because plants have variation, so usually you can sort of get around it a little bit. But if we try it in real time, we can see here that we've got the 0, 1, 2, and then some of these are divided right down to the midrib and some aren't. So that's why they're saying it's 2 to 3 times pinnate. Whereas something like the hemlock, you'd probably find this particular one was definitely 3 times pinnate. Something like the hogweed, you've got the 0 and the 1, and then these look like they're another division, but again, they're not properly going down all the way to the midrib, so it is only 1 times pinnate. And with hogweed, there's quite a lot of variation in the leaves as well. Hopefully that has helped. So we're going to get to that slightly trickier family to get our head around, Rosaceae, rose family. So as I was saying, there's obviously some that are quite obviously part of this family. Rose, for example, the roses, bramble, you know, I mean, it looks quite a lot like it. And then we've also got things like prunus and some of the, you know, sort of apple trees and things like that. Whereas something like meadowsweet, you wouldn't necessarily look at that and go, yeah, that's rose family. You might struggle to know what family that's from. Similarly with something like the salad bonnet or the lady's mantle. But we'll see that there are some generally rules that you can follow to know that that's the family you've got. So we'll start with the vegetative features first. So again, this is another one with alternate leaves, not opposite, and we do always have stipules in this family, but it's worth noting that sometimes they fall off, which isn't very helpful. So if you're using a key and it wanted to know about stipules and they've fallen off, that's going to be difficult, but usually it would sort of tell you that they fall early for that species, for example. And it's worth noting that this is an entire leaf, as it is, not these individual ones are individual leaves. This is a compound leaf, so it's formed of leaflets, and you can see the stipules at the bottom. So it's worth always trying to double check, have you got an individual leaf or have you got an individual leaflet when you're looking at plants? The leaves are pretty much often toothed along the edge, and most of the examples we'll look at are the same. And they usually have a petiole, which is the leaf stalk. So just to remind ourselves, we've got the leaf here, we've got the stalk going down to the stem, and that's known as the petiole, and then we've got the stipules at the bottom. Pedicel is sometimes a word that you might be familiar with, but that's usually referring to a flower stalk. So if it's a leaf stalk, it's a petiole. If it's a flower stalk, it's a pedicel. So you can see why you kind of have to get used to some of this terminology. The leaves are generally simple or compound, so they'll, you know, classic leaf shape, or maybe like this one, they're formed of individual leaflets, either in that sort of pinnate arrangement, or maybe in, you know, a different arrangement, palmate or something. So here we can see some real examples. We've got wild cherry here, you've got lovely toothed edges, a simple leaf. We've got a petiole, we've probably got some stipules under there. So that's a nice obvious one. Something like the creeping cinquefoil, the potentillas, they're all in the rose family. Again, we've got the nice toothed leaflets. We've got a petiole, but we've obviously got that arrangement of 5 leaflets creating this palmate leaf arrangement. Another palmate leaf arrangement here is the bramble, but still got the individual toothed leaves. And we've obviously got a petiole as well. So yeah, all of those follow that general rule. But the flowering features, one of the nice things about this is that we have 5 free petals. So unlike quite a lot of the other species we've covered so far, we've actually got separate petals, and we've also got separate sepals as well. And we've also got a fun little thing called an epicalyx. Now, essentially, we've got our calyx, which is the sepals that are fused together, and they would have been protecting the bud when it was developing. But then we've also got these extra little bits that you could be mistaken for thinking were part of the original calyx, but actually this is separate, and it's like this extra calyx, hence it's called an epicalyx. We've usually got many stamens, so quite a lot, and it's, as a general rule, it's about 2 to 4 times the number of sepals that you have. And then here's where it gets a little bit like, we often have, oh, sorry, let me go back, I clicked on the wrong bit. We'll come back to that ovary position. We often have a developed receptacle. Now, a receptacle is that sort of cup-shaped arrangement where it holds all of the parts of the flower, and all the flowering organs can kind of come off from. And quite often that forms basically a hypanthium, which is this sort of encasing part of it. We'll come on to that in a minute. So just covering a little bit about ovary position, and within the rose family, that's quite useful to understand this part. So essentially, if we've got an inferior ovary, then it means that the floral parts are inserted at basically the very top of the ovary. So the rest of the ovary is all underneath, meaning it's inferior, it's lower down. And then the hypanthium is essentially what develops around the ovary here. And in this sort of scenario here, this is what would be forming the outside of the hip if it was a rose, for example. So you can see the floral parts are inserted at the top. However, we've then got, in this case, in the rose family, where we've got a superior ovary, so the ovary is higher than where the floral parts are sitting. It's where the floral parts are, although they're sort of sitting up here, the ovary is actually sitting above the hypanthium, which has basically got the floral parts inserted up here. So you could see how you could get a little bit confused, but it's not enclosed around with the floral parts coming up here. So it's more like an open version of this one with the ovary sitting on top. So hence it's a superior ovary. And hopefully we've got some images to show you. So you can see on this dog rose here that we've got that hypanthium nicely forming around the ovary and the floral parts all inserted at the very top. So we've got an inferior ovary here. Whereas over here, you can see that we've got this more open arrangement with the hypanthium as this more sort of cup shape with the floral parts all sort of attached here, but technically with the ovary sitting above the hypanthium, therefore it is a superior ovary. Don't worry, that is a really tricky bit to get hold of. It's not always important for identifying species. It can just be quite a helpful thing to try and refresh every so often to get your head around. So fruiting features, unfortunately, in the rose family, hugely variable. And so that actually limits it in terms of a unifying trait within this family. Usually they have 1 to 2 seeds, but they can come in all sorts of forms. We can have an achene, like in the herb Bennett, for example. We could have a drupe, like in cherries. We could have drupelets, which are sort of all formed together in the blackberry. A pom, which is an apple, and you can see there the calyx where it was, and we've got the classic rose hip. So you can see, the calyx and the epicalyx are just at the top of where that fruiting area has formed. So moving on now to the last family we're going to cover today. So hopefully we will have some time for some questions, which I know is really valuable. We're doing the bedstraw family, the Rubiaceae. And you'll be pleased to hear that this one has so many unifying features, very, very distinctive group. And there's also not that many species in it in this country. So it's actually one that you could probably get to grips with fairly quickly. There are a few of the group that can be really tricky, like whether you've got fen bedstraw or marsh bedstraw, but I'm happy to tell you a really quick, easy way to tell the difference between the two. I'll come on to that in a minute. But let's look at some examples. So cleavers, also known as sticky weed, goosegrass, sticky willy, there's so many names out there. But it's essentially the one that you throw at your mates and it gets stuck on their jumper and then they walk around with it for ages on the back. But it is absolutely everywhere. It's a ubiquitous plant. It really likes anything that's fertile, loves road verges, disturbed ground, all of that. So yeah, it's one of the ones that I think as NPMS volunteers, everyone has seen increasing over time as well, really taking advantage of that situation of high nutrient deposition. Whereas on the flip side, you've got something rather more lovely like lady's bedstraw. There's only a handful that aren't white flowered. So lady's bedstraw and crosswort, one of them, and the one we'll get to in a minute is also not quite white. But this one's really nice in nice grasslands and prefers low nutrients, really. And then Squinancywort, which is possibly my favourite in the group just because of the cool name. This one really likes, your chalk grassland, your calcareous grassland, and it's very small and easily overlooked. At the moment, it's actually just in bud from where I've been anyway. So it's not quite out yet, but it's so easily overlooked because it is really fine leaved and it doesn't have very many leaves around the whirl, which is one of the key things for identification as well when it's vegetative. Crosswort, another one that likes the calcareous soils, but really intensely sort of hairy. And instead of having all flowers or borne at the top in a sort of raceme or corymb, it has them all the way around, sort of in the whorls with the leaves. And then hedge bedstraw as well, which is very similar to cleavers in terms of where you might find it, but not hairy and doesn't have those hooked hairs on them. So the really important things vegetative features wise is that those leaves are in a whorl. So it means like a spiral around the stem. And usually there's 4 to 12 leaves. But the thing is, I find really incredible about this group is that it says leaves and leaf-like stipules. Now you might think, well, I noticed the stipule on any of this family. It's because actually the leaves and the stipules look the same. And quite often you've only actually got 2 that are true leaves and the rest are made up with stipules. So a little bit of a mind-blowing moment there. But really doesn't matter whether you've got a stipule or a leaf, they look the same. And the most important thing is to count how many you've got going around in the world. The leaves themselves are usually simple. They're not sort of divided or anything. They're usually entire, so not toothed, but there are prickles, so that's a separate thing. And they are stalkless, so they just come down to the end where they come to the stem and usually narrow, but obviously that varies between species. So they often have these prickles on the margins of the leaves and also the stems. And the direction of these prickles and how they are is really important. So I was mentioning about marsh bedstraw and fen bedstraw. So marsh bedstraw would be at the point of the leaf, would be quite sort of almost rounded to the point that it doesn't have an extra bit, whereas fen bedstraw would have an extra prickle at the end. So I would say if you think you're in a wet habitat and you've got a little white like bedstraw, just pick it up and have a look and see whether it has that prickle or mucronate tip at the end of the leaf. If it doesn't, it's almost certainly going to be marsh bedstraw. And the marsh bedstraw has very small prickly edge bits, hardly anything at all. And on the stems also, whereas fen bedstraw, much more obvious prickles that are pointing downwards on the stem. And I believe, I'd have to double check this now because I haven't got my book next to me, they're going downwards on the leaves as well. But yeah, whereas less obvious prickles on the marsh bedstraw. So looking at some examples, we've got hedge bedstraw and cleavers next to each other, which I just thought was a nice way of trying to get your eye in on the differences. And obviously, if you were to feel these, the cleavers would be very rough and prickly and would stick to things, whereas the hedge bedstraw wouldn't. Something like northern bedstraw, much more stiff and rough, and you can see we've got sort of hairs and square like on the stems there. Whereas like sweet woodruff, not really hairy at all and has very broad leaves in the whorl, and the flowers just like a terminal thing up here, which is rather nice. So the flowering features, so they come in these compound cymes, but don't worry too much about that word. But essentially like a kind of panicle of flowers at the top is the most usual. And the flowers themselves are quite small, and they're 4 petals, except in wild madder, which has 5 petals. All the rest, I believe, are 4 petaled. So just that one random outlier, quite often the case with this sort of thing. Now, we don't have any sepals, or if we do, they're just minute. You can see on this particular species, we don't underneath. And we have a lovely arrangement of where the stamens are in the gaps between the 4 petals. And then we've got 2 styles or one that's sort of a branched style. And that's essentially the arrangement. Another example of some of the species, we've got field madder, really lovely little small lilac flowers. Again, confusingly in the book described as hairless, but with prickles. So again, it's where you draw the line on what's a hair and what's a prickle. And then we've got the heath bedstraw over here, but all have that lovely 4-petaled with the stamens in between sort of area. And then fruiting features, well, essentially we've got 2 nutlets, or in wild madder we have this sort of 2-seeded berry. But yeah, I mean, use your imagination as to what that really looks like. But yeah, we've got these 2 little nutlets that are often bird or haired or things like that. And that's what we always have. There's, you know, in certain species that how they're arranged can be quite, so what shape they are can be quite key. But generally they sort of all form that thing. So we'll do a quick recap over those 5 species, and then we'll see where we're at with questions. So the pea family, Fabaceae, So we've got that classic pea flower with the standard petal, the wing petals and the keel. We've got stipules, which are quite sort of distinctive and useful there. And we've got the leaf arrangement, sort of quite often trifoliate, sometimes pinnate, or sometimes like in gorse reduced to little spines. And then we've usually got the seeds forming in a pod of some kind. Moving on to the dead-nettle family, we've got the opposite leaves, we've got the square stems, we've got the petals which are fused into a corolla with that usually hooded upper lip and a lower lip, or sometimes not with so much of an upper lip. That's usually sort of 4 or 5 lobed. And then if we were to look down in the calyx, which is formed of an upper and a lower lip, usually with 5 teeth or so, we find that we've got this little 4 one-seeded nutlet arrangement down in the bottom. And then if we look at Apiaceae, the carrot family, we've got the inflated sort of basal sheaths to the leaves. We've got very small little flowers that are arranged in a mini umbel that then forms a bigger umbel. And we've got very distinctive and characteristic 2-sided seeds. And then in the rose family, we've got alternate leaves that have stipules. We've pretty much always got toothed leaves. And sometimes the leaves can be simple or they could be compound or palmate. And we've got that epicalyx, if you remember that extra calyx. And we've got 5 separate petals. And then finally, Rubiaceae, we've got the leaves in a whorl, which are a mixture of leaves and stipules, who knew? We've got bristles on the edges of leaves that are quite important. And the flowers are that lovely sort of cross shape, 4 petals with the stamen in between. And then the fruits are those 2 little sort of nutlets, basically a pair of nutlets. So what could you kind of do next to build on what we've learned today? So I would say just get out there and try and find some examples of these particular 5 families and see if you can tick off some of those key features that make it part of that family. And the more that you do this, the more you will be able to recognise when you've got something from that family. And you cannot possibly know every single plant in the UK. I certainly don't. But knowing that I've probably got something from a certain family always helps me be able to get to that next step much quicker. So yeah, just get out there and see what you can find, essentially. So I have about 10 minutes for questions, which should be about 8, I reckon.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you so much, Sarah. That was incredibly useful. And happily, somebody's popped in the chat. It was the best description of families they've received. So thank you ever so much. Please do add any questions you have for Sarah in the chat or in the Q&A. Just a couple of quick ones to kick us off, Sarah. Could you remind us what was the rose species example with the superior ovary that you provided?
Oh, the species. I don't actually know what that species was. So my colleague Sam produced those ones, but I can certainly find some examples of some with the the superior ovary is, oh yeah, so inferior ovary is the dog rose. If we have a look in my book at the rose family, it's the sort of thing where nobody would expect you to remember which one has which, but it's just understanding that when you're then being asked the question. So I'm just having a look. I don't know if anyone's used the rose key in, and when I say the rose key, it's not in Rose, it's in Collins, which could be a bit confusing. This is my copy that's all gotten wet, but anyway. So for example, yeah, the receptacle is cup shaped in things like the prunus, cherry and plum. So those would be probably the best examples of that one. So worth kind of having a look at those when they're sort of end of flowering and having a look at maybe chopping them up and having a look.
That's super helpful. Thank you so much. And actually, that's just reminded me to let everybody know that actually we have an interactive workshop scheduled in about a month's time, just over a month's time, with Sarah on the MPMS website. It's a workshop keying out how to use keys or unlocking botanical keys. So that's really worthwhile coming along to if you'd like to put that into practice and work through some keys with Sarah. Another quick question that I have here, Sarah. Oh, this is a good question actually. Are you able just to clarify the difference between a pinnate and a compound leaf?
Yeah, so essentially a pinnate leaf is a compound leaf, but compound is the broad term that encompasses whether you've got one that's a pinnate or a trifoliate or a palmate. Compound simply means it's made up of more than one leaflet. So that's the word compound or simple. So simple is what you would draw as a leaf if you sort of just drawing it on a book, just one simple thing. Compound is anything else if it's made up of leaflets, essentially. So pinnate being in particular the one where you've got the central midrib with then the individual leaflets coming off in a once pinnate fashion. If it's got three, then it's trifoliate. If it's roughly hand-shaped, then it's usually palmate.
Brilliant, thank you. You can totally understand when you first start to learn this terminology. Yeah, it's really good to ask these questions now. A few more comments. I haven't got any more questions quite yet. I've got somebody saying thank you for making it very enjoyable and memorable. I know I'm certainly going to take away looking for nice roasted buns or baked buns when I'm going out and looking at my Dead-nettle family. I love things like that to help me remember these things.
The other thing is it looks a bit like two cherubs' bottoms, like close together. So whatever way you want to look at it.
Whatever helps you to remember. Oh, and this is fun. Somebody's popped in. If you're into chemistry, connect the compound to more than one chemical. And that's how this person remembers it. I love it. I love hearing all these different ways that people remember what these different things mean. Oh, and I'm so glad to hear somebody here said it's made you want to go out to sketch some details. By all means, share some sketches with us too. We love to see what you're going out and how you're learning and how you're applying these sessions.
The other thing that could be quite fun to do is to look through your book and find the examples in those families that don't fit with the rest of it. So I always find that really interesting. Like when I was preparing for the Bedstraw section, I'd never really thought about wild madder particularly. I mean, I see it locally to me, I'm quite lucky, but I didn't realize it was the only one that had 5 petals compared with the rest that had 4, because I've, to be honest, never even seen it flowering much. And yeah, it's just funny when you find these random ones in the family that are still technically part of the family, but they're just not really like the rest of it at all. So when I was thinking of it when we were talking about the umbellifers, the sort of Apiaceae, and how you've got marsh pennywort, which is part of this family, and you would look at that, which is essentially like a kind of round sort of cloud-shaped circle little leaf that floats, and you would never know that that was part of the carrot family. It's just so out there and on its own. So yeah, interesting.
So yes, thank you ever so much, Sarah. So yes, a couple of things. I've mentioned already that we have the unlocking keys, botanical keys. But Sarah did also mention at the very start that Sarah has previously provided a really interesting talk, really introducing plant anatomy. So I did provide the link to that in the information for this session, but I'm just going to pop it here in chat. I say here, oh, I've just sent it to host and panelists. Hang on, let me send it to everybody. There's a link there just for anybody that does want to brush up on their plant anatomy, the terminology, different parts of the plant. That's a really, really useful webinar to go back and watch. And yes, it's done in the most amazing Sarah way that helps us to remember all these different things. So thank you so much. That was also timed absolutely impeccably.
No worries.
That's been really lovely. I shall let everybody get off to their lunch. Thank you so much, everyone.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Rachel. See you all soon.
Thanks so much for joining. Bye now.